This is Coffee with Kelly, a dynamic podcast that's dedicated to driving positive change in school safety. I'm your host, Ethan Woodman, Product Marketing Specialist for Crisis Go, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Kelly Moore, Senior School Safety Specialist for Crisis Go. Our mission is to empower you with essential knowledge, tools, and inspiration required to foster a safer and more secure school environment. We hope this podcast will be the catalyst for transformation in your schools. Join us as we continue to dive into the world of school safety.
Good morning, Jason.
Good morning, Kelly. How are you?
I'm well. I was just telling you, Ethan's not on this morning because he's been ill and the doctors kind of can't figure it out. But that doesn't mean we can't figure it out. So we'll do our best to work through this. For those of you,
he will be missed in our adult, and likely it probably is not a good idea that we're left without adult
supervision, right? And especially since the adult is half my age.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we're here with Jason Stoddard. Why don't you just remind people, he's been on before, but remind people who you are and what you do.
All right. So I am the Director of Safety and Security for the Charles County Public Schools. We're about 20 minutes south of Washington, D.C. We have 42 schools and centers, service about 28,000 kids a day, and have 4,000 staff members. I'm also the inaugural chair of the National Council of School Safety Directors, and Kelly is on the leadership committee with me. And we are a new organization that is making big waves in a pretty small pond. So we'll continue to do that and spreading the good word about how to keep our kids and our students as safe as we possibly can, utilizing the resources that are currently out there.
Yeah. So before we get into our topics, I think we have a fantastic set of questions that we're going to base this conversations on. I want to reiterate this. The NCSSD, the National Council of School Safety Directors, is under the umbrella of Zero Now. And their mission is to get victimization down to zero, with the understanding that no number of victims is an acceptable number. The only acceptable number of victims is zero, right? Did I say that correctly?
Correct.
So the reason I bring this up is, and this is not meant for anything other than our mission is to figure out how we get to zero. So every time there's an incident, as safety directors, as practitioners of school safety, every time there's an incident, we should sit back, look at what we're hearing, what we're seeing, and figure out how, if those same set of circumstances happened in our school, how would we prevent anyone from being victimized in that? So just take that for what it is. I'm not going to sit here and Monday morning quarterback, or at least today I'm not, Monday morning quarterback what happened recently. Everyone should have heard about it by now, and people should be taking actions. But our mission after every incident as school safety directors, as school safety practitioners, is as soon as that event is over, we start looking at how, if that happened at my school, how would I react to it? What steps would I take, and so forth. So with that, what are we talking about today, Jason?
Well, I think that, as we have this conversation in light of a couple different tragedies that have occurred in the K-12 space, we get the pressure in this career field to just do something. This happened, and what we've heard so far, these are what we believe are the facts at this point. These are the opinions of a lot of different people that have put out their talking pieces about this. And as a school board, we feel as though, or as a superintendent, we feel as though, or as a principal, we feel as though we just have to do something to show our community that we're doing something. And that's usually when some of the worst decisions are made inside of our with the idea of protecting our students. Those snap decisions without the thought process or the follow through of all the different tentacles that lead to those decisions and the effects of each decision. You may solve one problem, create five more because you just haven't planned it right. Your program management hasn't been good. So I think it is, in light of what we've seen specifically as we've started the school year, we're a couple weeks in most school districts, the idea of going back to the foundational pieces of school safety, and they're all free. And as we spoke about preparing for this, the foundational principles that I think we've seen put out from the United States government over the years, which I think are still valid today, having a strong relationships between staff and student body being number one, having positive school cultures and climates being number two, having a well-trained staff and student body being number three. And then I think adding a fourth to that is highly important, because what we see in a number of cases as it relates to school safety issues are students who have had trouble before and may or may not have, the code of conduct may or may not have been put into place at its most practical terms. So having a discussion and starting a discussion about your consistent enforcement of your organization's code of conduct that not only drives reflection and learning, but also has accountability built into it. And far too often, I think what we found across the United States as we've examined code of conduct, investigations, and accountability, in many cases, a vacuum has been created and accountability has been taken out of code of conduct violations and replaced by things like restorative approaches or just reflection and learning. And it's just the adolescent brain, so we don't want to hold them accountable. But there has to be accountability built in. We've seen the word consequences come into play, taking the place of accountability, but consequences and accountability are two different things. So I think we must begin to have a conversation about ensuring that schools have accountability in their code of conduct and that they're consistent, that they're not looking at statistics to drive decision-making on students that do things that violate the code of conduct, and they're worried about suspension statistics or things like that. They're responding to the events that occur in front of them. So if we can master all four of those things, or spend a great deal of time concentrating on all four of those things, those four things act as the pillars to keeping any K-12 school safe. Any technologies, shiny objects, or anything else that we put on top of that will never replace those four things. However, at the same time, if you don't master or aren't working on mastering those four things or haven't made those four things a priority, no technology is going to be helpful. A great example to that would be, I was listening to a podcast not too long ago, and they had a CTO and a superintendent on talking about the implementation of a gun detection system at their entry control point. And as they were speaking, what struck me was they did not even mention their security department. They did not even mention the fact that in this jurisdiction, they actually had their own independent police department that the school system ran. And they didn't talk about how there was any plan for their integration into this process. They talked about how the reason that they implemented this program was because they had found a couple of guns inside of their school, and their superintendent just wanted to do something. This is what they thought was the best thing. But then when you go back, and I was able to look up and research the school, I find in their recent assessments that are posted online that they have a horrible problem with propping doors open. So you can put weapons detection in the front of your school and at all your doors and everything else. But if you're propping doors open because you don't have a well-trained student or staff and student body who abides by policies, those weapons detection systems do absolutely nothing, and they're a huge waste of taxpayer funding.
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack there. So we'll take this in smaller chunks, but I call this, when I talk to people, you need to understand the manual processes before technology will help you. Right? You need to know how to lock the doors. You need to know how to lock down, evacuate, all of those things before technology will help you. Technology will make it easier and will allow you to document and those types of things, maybe communicate better and wider, those types of things. But when we're talking about the consequences and the consistency, and I agree, consequences are different than holding somebody accountable, because you can have negative consequences and positive consequences. So just saying consequences doesn't work. If you want to say we're going to hold somebody accountable so that they have positive consequences that help them grow, help them learn, help them develop as citizens and so forth, okay, great. But you can't just say consequences, because you have to use those differently for different people. But I will say, when you said consistency, again, consistency is the key to life. And when you start talking about just about anything, if we do it consistently, we are a product of what we are doing. And so when you're starting to build a safety culture, consistency, if you're consistently doing that, it now becomes part of your culture, part of a sustainable program, and so forth. If you consistently don't do it, you're going to have these tragedies, and people are going to start pointing and saying, you did this wrong. You didn't do this. You should have done this. You're going to lose that battle. Obviously, in both of our jobs, our full-time jobs, we're trying to help you prevent that from occurring. Let's look at consistency. Let's work through that. So when we're talking about the strong culture, climate, so forth, what's the key to getting that done? We'll get into the other factors shortly.
So, I think the key is to make sure that the school is a positive place. Especially at the secondary level, as you're relating to mascots and things like that, sporting events and athletics, I think it becomes a little bit easier to drive that positive culture, to establish community norms around behaviors, and to establish internally, to establish what is acceptable, what behaviors that we allow, that we accept, and what things they can do, schools can do to ensure that they're keeping the positive feelings, the vibes around what's going on inside the school.
Yeah.
But I think what we don't talk about enough is the importance of community as a whole's involvement in school culture. Just to put it as bluntly as we possibly can, schools have kids for about 6.5 to 7 hours a day. They go to school sometimes 5 days a week. A vast majority of the time, it's less than 5 days a week. Mm-hmm. So when you start to figure out that math, kids are outside of school a tremendous amount more than they're inside of school. And if kids are struggling with certain things and behaviors outside of school, the likelihood of them struggling with those same behaviors and bringing those same activities into school greatly increases. What I like to discuss, especially with our community partners, is the idea of having a school having the community throw their arms around that school. And school safety starts at home, as we always talk about. So it's important that we have community involvement in what goes on in our schools and what's acceptable behavior and the support of the school system. One of the things that I think you'll remember is back when you were in school and when I was in school, if the teacher called home, the accountability was usually pushed out well before any questions were asked.
Swift and severe is what I would
correct.
say.
And today, it would seem that when a school official calls home to far too many of our parents, it becomes, well, what did you do to cause this? And we've lost that trust in many cases, or there's been a reduction of trust or legitimacy. And I think that is a place of culture and climate that we have to think of as well.
Yep. I think there's been a shift, and I'm not going to absolve the school from this shift, because I think they have a big part of it, is there's been a shift from parents being parents to people expecting the schools to be parents. And when we don't hold our own kids accountable for their actions, and we're not giving them consequences for their actions, and you can use either positive or negative, that's your choice as a parent. But when we say that the school is having our kids and they're parenting our kids, then we sort of relinquish that. So you get what you get. And I don't know, I'm the parent of two fairly good kids. One's a lawyer, one's in the Navy. I guess that's okay.
We'll take the lawyer out.
Hi. I raised one of those. Very proud of her. Don't get me wrong. I'm very proud. She's very smart and very capable. But all joking aside, is we have to take our own parenting responsibilities. We have to know where our kids are at. I remember back in the day when the TVs were on, the TVs used to say, it's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your children are? Right. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to start asking, where are children? What are they doing? And get them off the screens, get them more involved in organized sports and community deals, whether that's gymnastics or dance or soccer or whatever. But when we're creating this culture, I do believe that at times, and I think this is not necessarily good, and you can feel free to disagree with me, I'm okay with that, is that I do think oftentimes our schools say, I am with your kids more than you are. They come to school at 7:00. Some of them, especially if they're in athletics and other programs, sometimes don't get home till 6 or 7 in the evening, especially in the secondary schools. And you feed them, they do their homework, and they go to bed, and they start all over again. But if that's the case, then that illustrates the need. If you're going to co-parent with families as a school, you need to work together as a team, not as, oh, while they're here, they're mine. This becomes this sort of divorce family sort of setting. And we know that most of the times, if you have one parent saying one thing and another parent saying something else, that causes confusion, frustration, conflict, all of those things that don't contribute to strong, positive culture climate.
So obviously politics plays a role in all this, yep. Right? And it's like when we do onboarding, I try and tell our staff members and our new staff members, and even when we do our annual safety briefings, we talk about politics in the classroom, and we talk about the idea that if we have 28,000 students in the Charles County Public Schools, that in theory there are 28,000 sets of parents. And when the curriculum moves away from, one of the best things about being an educator, at least here is we purchase your curriculum. We teach you to teach that curriculum, and then we expect you to teach that curriculum, and we'll support you in teaching that curriculum and having the conversations that curriculum requires. However, when the conversations move from the curriculum into more political or social discussions, they need to be in the middle, and that if there are questions that are outside the realm that we need to be answering, that those kids be sent to their parents to have those discussions.
Yep.
We as schools are seen as the government. There are two pieces of government, which both you and I have had the luxury of working for over our careers, that interact with the citizens of the United States more than any other: law enforcement and public schooling. And seldom do you ever get excited when the government is standing on your front door, or the IRS sends you a letter. It's not like you get super excited and it's like Santa Claus sent you a letter. It's a trepidatious moment in your life when the IRS sends you something. So it's important that schools understand that we are the government, and in a polarized society, we have to be extra careful to ensure that our education is not a indoctrination piece. And, I get a little bit of trouble when I say this by certain people, but our employees, our educators go to school for 4, 8, and 12 years in order to educate kids, not raise them. And that's an important inflection point that I think more superintendents need to be willing to have tough conversations with their communities about. We have to understand that we are ultimately responsible for the safety and security of our children. And as one of the questions I'd be curious to pick your brain about is where do you think school safety directors have a role or a boundary in the institution of school discipline, school consequences, school accountability?
Mm-hmm.
Because I know I have my position, and I think that's a open-ended question inside of the school safety director profession.
Yeah. So here's my position on that. And that is, especially from a safety perspective, when we're talking about school discipline and how it's being meted out in today's world, they often use these alternative programs to what you and I grew up with, restorative approaches and those types of learning disciplines, or IEPs or 504s. They often use those as excuses not to discipline. So when it becomes a disciplinary problem, obviously there's laws that have to be followed. In California, they called it a manifestation hearing. So if the disciplinary problem that you're trying to deal with is a manifestation of their disability, you can't discipline on that. So you have this hearing. The problem is that the school stopped disciplining them because the manifestation hearing wasted their time. They would discipline and not, or they would try to discipline and then go to the hearing, and the hearing says, oh, this is a manifestation of their disability. And that's not always the case. And so I'm not sure that our manifestation hearings are working appropriately, or they're too lenient, or they're too vague in the guidelines that they're using, and so forth. When you are doing a discipline and you are dealing with an IEP or a 504, and you're going to get to a manifestation hearing, here's what, from my perspective, those are two parallel processes, the manifestation and the discipline. They should run, and they should run knowing that they're going to convene together at some point, and you should be able to justify why you want to discipline that person, and then force them to defend why they should not be disciplined, right? From a safety perspective, we should, as safety directors, we should get involved in the disciplinary process only if it's one of these two things from my perspective: a concerning behavior or a safety issue. And the reason I say that is because that's what we're really looking at. If it's just a behavior problem and a rebellion or a kid thing, this is typical of a high school or a middle school kid. Once we determine that it's just regular discipline and regular behavior issues based upon their developmental stages, then that's not a safety director's perspective. Once it continues or it becomes, and it crosses that line into becoming a safety, and we could define what that is, a safety issue, then I think that has to be reviewed by the safety director and recommendations made, and say, look at, and I'll give you an example for the school district that I worked with. And when I got there, they pointed out this kid. This kid was a fourth grader, 10 years old, 5'10", close to 300 pounds, huge kid, 10 years old. And admittedly, his goal was to become his life goal was to become head of the Mexican mafia. And he was disruptive, he was intimidating, and you have all these elementary school teachers and elementary school principals and counselors and so forth who don't have any idea how to deal with this. And I said, when I came in, they told me about this young man. And I said, okay, so how are we dealing with him? He's got an absent mother, no father. The mother believes that it's the school's responsibility to take action, not hers, all of these things. And I said, okay, so how are we dealing with the discipline problems at school? Well, he's got an IEP. And I said, so? They said, well, we can't because of this. I says, there is nothing in an IEP process that says you have to put up with a violent kid in your class and that he can disrupt the entire school. There's nothing there. And they designated him as a fourth grader as the most violent kid in the entire school district. I said, when I walk into a situation and that's what I'm confronted with, that kid doesn't belong in my school. Find a way to get him out. Teach him at home, send him to an alternative school. I don't know. But to answer that question, it becomes, I shouldn't be involved with every suspension, every expulsion, because there's valid reasons to do that have nothing to do with the safety of the school. So as soon as it becomes a safety issue, then it becomes my problem.
And I think it's important that as we talk about this, I know that, the special education students that have the 504 and IEP monikers, they, in our school district at least, they quite frankly make up a smaller percentage of our overall discipline. And I know in many cases we talk predominantly, as we're talking about this subject, there's a natural drive to go to, well, some of these students we can't treat like the other students because they have certain monikers. And in many cases there is valid reasons for that. But I would have to agree with you that the special education system, they've got some really good advocates, and there's a lot of kids who need a lot of help. But we also know that there's a percentage of those kids that have those monikers that also specifically at the older ages use it as a crutch and will specifically tell you at times, I got an IEP, there's nothing you're going to do to me. And that's not what the system was designed to do. And, but where I think a vast majority of organizations are struggling too is even the students that don't have those additional protections or those additional processes that must be looked at before consequences or accountability is dealt out. They have gone to the point of view of, we're going to struggle to hold anybody accountable.
Yep.
I'll give you a great example of hall walkers. In every state, what I've learned in this position as a chairman is that every state is much different as it relates to how they enforce special education laws, how they enforce IEPs, 504s, FAPE, and all those other things. And like in our jurisdiction in the state of Maryland, the code of conducts are basically all the same across the state as a demand by the Maryland Department of Education. And I think that's a huge mistake because it reduces local control. And one of the things that we find is that kids who are tardy for the bell or hall walkers, there are very little to any consequences for that or accountability for that behavior. And when that low level behavior is allowed, whether they're IEP, special ed, or anything else, when that type of behavior is allowed, we tend to see other behaviors now increase. So for example, if we have 10 kids that are walking a hallway and they go to school and that's all they do is for the social aspects of school, and they just walk the hallway, and they're disruptive. They're not fighting, but they're disruptive. They're making noise in the hallway and things like that. Out of those 10, maybe 2 of them are have some additional protections and some additional processes must be going through to hold accountable. But instead of the other 8 being dealt with, none of them are ended up being dealt with because, there's nothing we can do if they're skipping school. Again, much driven by each state. And I think when we start to look at the provable facts that if we deal with the smaller things and if we hold people and we deal with the smaller events, the larger events tend to disappear. And we're struggling with that in public education specifically for a number of different reasons. And, I think that it's important that we understand that, especially as it deals with that 4th thing about the consistent application of a code of conduct that not only that drives it, that also has an accountability piece. Mm-hmm. When you completely remove something without a valid replacement, it creates a vacuum. And we're not only seeing that in schools, but we're also seeing it in the juvenile justice systems all across the United States. Specifically here in the state of Maryland, they have changed the juvenile justice laws tremendously and subsequently basically taken accountability out of the entire process. And now we're seeing latest of a 12-year-old that had committed 22 crimes in a very short period of time. And each time he gets arrested, they A, can't talk to him because of a new law, and B, they can't charge him criminally for it because Maryland only allows you to charge when when they're over 13. And, here's a kid who's stealing cars, breaking into businesses and things like that. So when we pull things with a likely a valid, a good intent, but when you pull things completely off the table that have worked for centuries, or at least partially worked for centuries, and replace it with nothing, or things that there's no provable evidence that they're actually working, you create a vacuum. And in that vacuum will be filled by this type of abhorrent behavior that we're seeing more and more in our schools. And it's becoming more and more of a struggle. And, unfortunately, as we sit here and talk, we've been talking for, 30 or 40 minutes. What we haven't talked about is the 90% of our kids that are great kids that are in public schools doing the right thing for the right reasons. And those kids are the victims of the violence and the victim of what at a broader spectrum, the disruption of 10% of our kids that are really struggling and need some extra supports. And we don't talk about those 90% of those kids, your kids, my kids, most other people's kids, those 90% of the kids that are those victims of violence and disruption in the K-12 space. And we need to talk more about them.
Yep, I agree. And my wife and kids classify me as not having a heart, not being emotional, those types of things. But the reality is society's become too emotional and haven't looked at the consequences of the emotionality of our society. And what I mean by that is we're making decisions based upon how we feel, not the actual statistics that back it up, and not the evidence-based decision-making processes that we use, not seeing something and saying, hey, that's outside of the standard. Let's start dealing with the standard. And like what you were saying, we have to be careful about this. I'll give you a perfect example where there was a system-wide breakdown in lots of things. In New York City, back in the early 2000s, they had this policy that they called it the broken window effect, right?
I was trying not to say because it's a lightning rod.
Yeah, because I'm going to bring it up, and I'm going to tell you why that was a failure. It was a failure because initially it showed huge success because everyone understood the purpose and why they were doing it. And the process was, let's start addressing these broken windows in our neighborhoods. Let's start addressing the small things, and we can have a huge impact on the rest of the community culture. They'll start taking ownership back in their neighborhoods. They'll start holding each other accountable. They'll be owners of their community. Fast forward 20 years, and essentially the law that allowed law enforcement to do that was stop and frisk. You have a reasonable suspicion. They lost the meaning of that, and they just started stopping people, and they couldn't articulate why they were stopping them. They were just stopping and saying, okay, I'm going to run you for a warrant and I'm going to get you out of here and so forth. But if we understand that if we consistently apply disciplinary pressure, accountability pressure, but we consistently apply that, then everyone understands the expectation. But as long as we take one of the other ends of what you wanted to talk about is having well-trained people, understanding why we're doing something, how we do it, with whom we do it with, and so forth, then we become to a place where we're seeing noticeable impacts on our community culture, our safety. But we have to address, like you said, the little things. We have to look at the little things, and we have to understand why and how those little things impact the larger picture. Because if you allow those 2 out of the 10 to just walk the halls because they have an IEP or a 504, then you have a hard time explaining why the other 8 can't, right? And oftentimes we take the easy way out and just say, well, they can do it. Why can't these guys do it? Well, because these guys have special circumstances and we need to deal with that. And then we can start working on the other 8.
So so for the listening audience that is may not be familiar, James Wilson and George Kelling's broken windows theory that has been, it's been completely misunderstood in the police reform era, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yep.
The actual concept is still valid, and the practice of stop and frisk may be something that may have been a product of broken windows, but ultimately the end result is if you take care of those small things, just like in our normal lives, if we take care of the small things, the big things tend to disappear. That concept doesn't change no matter what we call it.
That's correct.
And, I think when we look at all of these things, the little things, it goes back to the initial point that you spoke about, and the idea that in the light of tragedies, we see a lot of finger pointing and a lot of blame and a lot of that just do something mindset and things like that. When if we step back and, as another famous podcaster talks about, he has a 24-hour rule. He would much rather be right than first. And if we step back and we wait for those after action reports, we wait for the facts to come out, and then overlay what we are doing as an organization. And then where are those holes? We did the exact same thing with the Uvalde tragedy. We pulled out all the 77-page report that the Senate did, and then we pulled out a couple of the other reports. I think Texas Alert did another one. Mm-hmm. And we overlaid all those things on everything that we are doing here. And one of the things that came specifically out of that was an opening schools checklist. Having a checklist that our schools, and it's a 4-page checklist that we have that we give to every one of our schools and say, here, these are the things that you need to do to open your schools safely. The other big thing that came out of that for us was the idea that the law enforcement officials at Uvalde did not initially report could not tell whether the individual was in a classroom or was in a closet or a hallway or an office. So what we did to eliminate that, because when you talk about that, you can look at mapping and you can look at all these other different things. The easiest, quickest way to communicate what are classrooms and what classroom numbers are where, and to overlay a map and to orient a map and everything else to what goes on, was to post the classroom numbers on an exterior window. So every one of our classroom numbers, if you go to any of the 42 schools and centers in Charles County, every one of the classrooms is identified with a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper that is printed off, that is taped in the bottom left-hand corner of every window, just to delineate what the classrooms are. Our offices don't have them. Our libraries don't have them. Our media centers, our cafeterias, only the classrooms. That's what I think a leading practice inside of our profession would be, is to wait for those facts to come out and then to overlay and then make decisions on where your holes may be or what you can improve upon. I think that, some of the things that we're going to see that are going to come out of these most recent tragedies, one which is 2 hours away from us in Joplin, Maryland. That one looks completely different. That was community-based gun violence, targeted attack on a specific student. That the mitigation strategies look completely different for that type of an incident than they do for an active shooter takeover style attack that we saw in Georgia. And I think the best of us sit back and we go, okay, let's get all the facts out. Let's see what we can do, and then come up with those recommendations, or where were the holes and what do we need to do to ensure that these things don't happen. I think when we look at some of the preliminary things that are coming out of Georgia, behavioral threat assessment piece, those are going to be really big concentrations on that tragedy. The 90% of these people these attackers that leak their information in one form or fashion or another. I think that's going to be a real big push there versus the physical security side of things as all of that information comes out. But that's where I think the best of us, and we look at these four fundamentals of a well-trained staff and student body. We look at, that consistent application of the code of conduct, which also includes behavioral threat assessment, but not in a consequence form or an accountability form.
Yeah.
And then that well-trained, that strong student cultures and climates and positive relationships between staff and student bodies. All four of those things are the answers to the broader questions for school safety and security, in my simple mind, that aren't shiny objects and aren't millions and billions of dollars.
Yeah. I don't disagree with you. When I said the next day, we should be looking as safety directors and school safety practitioners, we should be looking at, if that happened at our school, we should be looking at that. Absent the lessons learned, we will learn the lessons as they come out. So if you take that scenario based upon your first 5 minutes of watching the news, you have a pretty good idea of what happened, right? Now, you take that 5-minute scenario, dude came in, left, tried to get back in, shots fired. You take that and you say, under those circumstances, how would my school react? How would my school prevent that? Based upon what your current status is in the whole safety, security realm, and start learning based upon and identifying your gaps. Do you have gun detection? Do you have shot detection? Do you have metal detectors? Do you have access control? Do you have visitor management? How did this kid, as we find out, how did he get on the bus with a weapon and not get detected? How did all these things happen? We'll learn those lessons. But if we understand we have a certain set of circumstances and we start applying what we know early to our status and our situation, we can learn a lot ourselves. And we can say, wow, I'm not sure our people know how to do this or when to do this, right? And why to do this. And we start asking those questions, and then we can start fortifying our position. Then and I agree, there's lots of lessons we're going to learn. And we're already seeing the first iteration of after action reviews come out. And we're going to find more as those other more in-depth, more accessible interviews occur. We're going to start finding things out, and we're going to learn lots of things. And we should take those lessons and we should apply those lessons. But that doesn't mean we need to wait a month to start doing it, is my point. We can start almost immediately and start saying, wow, if that kid showed up here doing that, what would I do? Would my people know what to do? Or are we good? Right? I mean, that might be the case. I don't know there's very many schools that can 100% prevent those things, but they can take actions earlier or whatever, right? So that was my point there.
Yeah, no, and I get it. We know these situations sadly breed additional situations traditionally. And I think anytime that we have one of these major events that gets national news coverage, because sadly, so many school safety issues don't get the national news coverage that the active assailant, specifically the active assailant events, do get.
Yep.
You likely would have never heard about Joplin had it not been because it was directly right after the tragedy that happened in Georgia. And these tragedies, unfortunately, as it relates to gun violence, occur far too often within inside of our K-12 space. But with that said, there are also the overwhelming discussion points, both from a solution provider standpoint and also many of the scholars, I guess is the best way that you put it, with inside of our career field that want to talk about nothing but gun violence. And luckily, while it happens far too often, it is also not something that is a daily occurrence in most in any school in the United States for the most part. And it drives the overall conversation. And that also is something that we have to protect against. But I think the point that you're making is, specifically in the K-12 space, and especially in the K-12 space, we have to adopt a lifelong learning model in everything that we're doing as it relates to the keeping of our campuses, our students, and our staff safe. And we constantly have to be evaluating, because the threats continuously change and the technology continually changes, and it continues to be very burdensome and difficult inside the silos of the bureaucracy of public education to ensure that we're all talking together.
Yep.
And that we're all realizing the things that are out there. For example, I had a conversation the other day with a planning and construction group, and we're talking about cameras, and they're talking about how they want to spend a bunch of money on a specific camera to put 40 foot in the air and has a license plate reader on it and everything else. Well, that's all great and fine. However, a 40 foot in the air camera is not going to do any good if you have any other type of appliance attached to your camera, whether it's artificially intelligent gun detection, maybe a gunshot detection, glass, whatever you're going to do. It's also going to make it almost impossible to be able to identify facial features of anybody from 40 foot in the air, no matter how good the camera is. And the LPR technology, while amazing, school systems don't have access to NCIC. So the only people that are going to benefit from the LPR is likely the local police, and you've got to have some type of agreement with the local police. And why would you fund that when it's really not going to help you? Because the amount of times that you're going to have to put in, we don't want this car in our system, and that LPR is going to be active for you, is going to be highly limited.
The technology at LPRs, you can have your own LPR. You're not going to know the registered
Correct.
owner, but you can say this car is prohibited from, and use the tag number, right? And say,
Correct.
So there is some use to it. It is limited, and I think it should be limited, but you're absolutely right. There's this overwhelming, and sorry for the interruption, but there is this overwhelming thought process that technology is the answer to school safety. And, we just need the camera. We just need this access control. We just need this LPR. We need this. Cameras are a perfect example. Everyone says we just need cameras. Well, if you're not monitoring them 24/7, every single one of them, then they're recording devices.
Forensic.
Forensic. And if you are monitoring them 24/7, you're spending an awful lot of money, right? So AI helps with that, but you have to be able to understand. And I think you'll agree with me. I spent 34 years of my job was centered around dealing with failures of society, failures of processes, failures of all kinds of failures. So when I start looking at safety features, I always ask myself two questions. What happens if? Oftentimes that what happens if is followed by it fails. If this fails, and then the second question is, what's next? If this fails, what do I do next? If this happens, what do I do next? Right? So what if this happens? What if that happens? What if it fails? What if I don't have it? How am I accounting for it? What's next? What's my next move? And I think if we start working into that, and I'm going to also add, I think if we start looking at that, what if this happened? What would I do? What's next? Those things. I think we go a long way to transitioning from principals or superintendents that think, oh, I have to do something to appease our community. Oh, we just bought this $1 million system that doesn't really work anywhere. We don't know how to use it, but somebody said we needed it, so we're going to do it, to actually understanding that if we have this, how to use it, why it's good. And again, we can get back into that whole, I can make your school look like a prison, but we know everything that happens in society happens in prison. So people, the bottom line is people's our typical failure point, right?
To build on what you just said, and I'm looking at my my board over here, I use a term called the next. What is, if as you just described it, it is, what is the next? And that 5 whys. Why does this happen? Why does that happen? And once you get to about the third why, usually you finally got to the actual issue that we're dealing with. And I think that's where the best of us, the best people that are in this profession, the best, as you spent 34 years in law enforcement. I was about 24 and a half, 25. The best commanders were the ones that were strategic, that could play that next game, that weren't just worried about today. They were managing today, but leading for tomorrow. And I think in our profession, that's what we have to have. What is the next? I know controversial subject that I'll throw out there that maybe for another day. But when we look at school safety and security, we've seen vehicle-borne attacks all across the spectrum of threats to everything else. But we've never really talked about vehicle-borne attacks in the K-12 space. Mm-hmm. Maybe that next is, if you've mastered those, if you're mastering those fundamentals and concentrating on those fundamentals, and you've gotten, you've really concentrated on your deterrence and your detection, and you've built in those fundamentals, and you've got the technology in place that you're doing those things that allow you to now move more towards that next thing. Is it worth having a discussion about placing ballards at the entry control points that do not affect ADA? And I know there's some of the scholars that are in this profession that are completely dead set against that. However, I think there's a valid discussion to be had about somebody who takes a vehicle and rams it through the front of a building into a lunchroom. And to think that that's not something that's possible or that we need to be thinking about, I think is limiting our scope and limiting what we need to be doing. And again, the best of us, the emergency manager side of what we do, I think drives us to that next. And we always should be managing for today, but leading for tomorrow, and trying to figure out what that next is going to be.
Yeah. So the question obviously is you have, how many people you have working for you?
Just me.
Just you?
Well, so I have a couple different sides, but in the school safety side of things in my organization, it's just me.
Okay. So
but I have other employees that I can.
So how many arguments do you get in with yourself? Just kidding.
But that's interesting because up until recently, I had a former principal that worked for me. So I was able to say to him, and one of the blessings of our relationship was I could come up with the most harebrained schemes, throw them to him, and he'd be like, that's never going to work in a K-12 environment.
Yeah. Right.
That person just doesn't work for me anymore, but I still have those relationships that allows me to do that.
Yeah. So the question becomes, when we rely on a school safety director and we start saying, what's the next, then we have to convince our leadership, our cabinet, our school boards, that there's some validity to that. And in your case, I actually got that question at a conference one year when I was in Missouri. It was a question from a former Special Forces Army Ranger. And he says, I'm not even interested in anything you're selling until you can tell me that you can stop a semi from running into my building. I said, I can do that. No, you can't. I said, yeah, you can. The technology's there. All you need is a trigger. You can have them. I mean, they have them at the White House for God's sake.
They're called Masaka barriers.
They flip down and they flip up, right? Or you can do what Target does, right?
Exactly.
They have these big balls that is the logo of Target, but what they really are is security for their front door. They're these huge concrete barriers, and they don't interrupt the flow of Target. They're not going to interrupt the flow of the schools. So, and that's where SEPTED comes in, crime prevention through environmental design, right? So there's lots of that, but we have to convince them to do that. And that's one of the biggest frustrations. We talked about this briefly in one of our last meetings that we had, where unfortunately we have a lot of people who are very dedicated, very driven in the school safety director positions, but they're short-lived, right? Why is that? Why can't we get people who, there are some people, I know Ron, Self, Guy Blissner, those guys have been around for 30 years, 20 years, whatever it is. That's a long time, but that's not the norm. The norm is just a couple of years. We need to figure a way to keep our people happy, and let me know if you have any thoughts on that.
So I don't think it's keeping them happy as much as it's having the position be respected. And I think this is also part of the infancy of school safety directors. Yes, they've been around in forward-leaning organizations for a number of years. However, with that said, I think that as we are building the momentum to see school safety directors across the United States and the value, we also have to understand that for many of us that are coming from the outside of education, and believe me when I say some of the best school security directors that I work with have been former teachers and administrators and things like that who have learned this as well. But there's also a place to be said that law enforcement, emergency management, fire, EMS can come into this position as well. We have to figure out a way to integrate ourselves into a very tight-knit community. And just think about if you were a police officer and a teacher came in and became your deputy chief and was going to teach you how to de-escalate and be better with people, we would be suspect as well. And so we have to figure out a way. And from far as I'm concerned, it's incumbent upon the school safety directors to figure out a way to integrate themselves, especially at those cabinet level positions, to integrate themselves into what is likely already a formidable team and make sure that they are building those positive relationships. And I think that's where it gets back to some of the things that we've talked about through NCSST is the importance of those soft skills, the importance of being able to understand those soft skills, and that you're coming into a formidable team that already exists with knowledge that you need to pass on in a way that is palatable to those individuals. And it's never a my way or the highway thing. And far too often, I think in some cases, it becomes that because of our upbringing, because we're type A personalities, because of where our strengths are. So, yes, I believe, but I also believe that we're in the infancy of seeing this as a mass project to put school safety directors in every district across the United States. And we're going to have, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time?
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing.
But it also takes, and I don't disagree with you. I agree with you. It does take the respect. It does take the understanding. It takes the professionalization of the school safety position. And it takes the culture shift from why do I need this, or that I actually need this, right? Like we've said, there's a director for everything else in the school system. Why is there not across the board? Again, we're 25 plus years past Columbine. Why is there not already this culture of, oh, we need a director of safety? They just continue to hand that off, or they don't respect the expertise of that person that they have in there. Part of that is because the person they have in there is an expert. I think that's the case. I mean, I see it all the time in my current job position, where we have this trend to require panic buttons in our schools, yet the schools are still saying, I don't want everyone to have the ability to press the button to report that I saw a guy walking through the hall with a gun. I want them to call somebody first. Well, that's a culture that's deep-seated in everything that they do. But when you have an emergency, you don't want to spend 3 minutes on a phone with Mrs. Jones in the third grade saying, hey, I think this guy, well, are you sure? Going back, press the button and then figure it out. We get this sort of conflicting issue going on. Well, I don't want everyone to do this. Yet the trend and everything legislatively and mandates are they want you to give a button to everybody. Right?
Well, and remember, as nothing's new under the sun, right? So
Right.
I know you remember when we were getting radios in law enforcement that had emergency buttons on them. They had the orange buttons on them.
Yeah.
And the conversations at the executive level was, do we really give these to all these guys? Because they're going to accidentally set them off when they take their gun belts off to go to the restroom, or they're going to accidentally push them and we're going to hear things that we don't need to hear over our radio system. And it's the same thing in the schools. The law enforcement overcame that 15 years ago when the EA buttons came in. School systems will overcome a lot of that as it continues to get better, as those technologies get better, as all those things get better, and as the acceptance of them becomes more wide ranging. Because remember, schools have been very siloed for a number of years.
Yeah.
And much of this we've seen, think about where we were in 2018 prior to Parkland with all the technology as it relates to school safety versus where we are today, 6 years later. Yep. Think about where we will be 6 years from now in 2030 and what will be available and on the market to help safeguard schools. But drawing this full circle back to those four things, none of that will replace those four things. And until our schools can get those four things mastered and continue to work on them, no matter what technology we put into place, is not going to be as effective as it possibly can be without the mastering of the concentration, the prioritization of those four fundamental and foundational principles.
I 100% agree. I use the 3 pillars when I try to explain things, and those are policies that are created and driven, the processes and systems that are in place, and finally, the people. Are you training your people to do what is right when it's right and so forth? Are you constantly moving through this? And so I use a little bit different terminology, but it's essentially the same thing. You have to have the policies that are driving that. You have to have systems and processes that are in place to make sure that you are using the proper technology at the right time. And I'm not saying you need to have a bunch of technology. I do think technology does help, but none of that works if you're not training your people, you're not holding them accountable, and you're not mandating they do certain things. So fundamentally, I think you're right. There's too much relying on technology to be the solution. When in this time where we're at today, number one excuse for not doing something is money. The second is time. You have time. You can make time. Time is cheap. Most of the solutions that we've talked about, most of the things that we've talked today, don't cost you anything. They cost you time. They cost you effort. They cost you work. All of those are free. I'm telling you, you can have a secure building that's not safe, and you can have a safe building that's not secure. We need to find that balance, and we need to, theoretically, if you had all of these things in place that we talked about today, you might not need technology, theoretically. But we're dealing with people, so that's a vision that likely will never come to fruition. But Jason, thank you so much. Anything you want to say before we?
No, thank you, Kelly. I think I'd strongly encourage all your listeners to check us out at ncssd.org. Join our efforts.
Yep.
We're partnering with a lot of wonderful organizations that are pushing this forward, that we all understand our why and why we do this. And it's not about money. It's about our kids. It's about our staffs. Our why is pretty clear. We want to be as inclusive as we possibly can be. We're about building bridges, not burning them. So we would fully invite anybody who's interested in the K-12 space, aspiring, current, and retired school safety directors, anybody who's interested to look at Zero Now and to look at NCSSD and join our efforts. We're starting regular membership meetings that are discussing very unique topics to what we have. We have all the professionals, plenty of professionals to talk about things. First one that we did was in January, talked about cell phone bans, and seemed to lead that discussion that we've seen ever since then, and having 20 to 30 professionals from across the United States to talk about lessons learned, things that they wish they would have known, best practices or leading practices or whatever we want to call it. The next one is going to be about sports athletics, securing athletic and after school activities. Events. And then we've got a whole list of them moving forward. So
yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. I'm sure we'll do this again because these are great conversations.
Feel like I'm with Joe Rogan. You're getting to that level.
Yeah. Don't tell anybody. I have a lot of people who would say, what? Kelly's doing what? Including my kids.
Yes, exactly.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And if you have any questions about what we discussed, leave a comment on our website at crisisgo.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on Coffee with Kelly, a discussion on school safety.